So this is another presentation in the series of Bible stories we think we know, and this time we're looking at the story of the paralysed man Jesus encountered at the pool of Bethesda. Once again, we're trying to unpick this story to see if there are some lessons we can learn which we may not previously have thought of. So here's the story from John's Gospel, chapter 5. There is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by five covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralysed, and they waited for the moving of the waters. Time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. Now, just before we get into this story, I want to begin by looking at another, more recent and nearer to home. Sometime around about the 7th century CE, or AD if you prefer the old way of stating it, this was a time when there were missionaries, Celtic missionaries, coming across from Ireland to the wilds of North Wales to bring the gospel message to the people living there. And one such chap, a guy by the name of Bueno, of course now referred to as Saint Bueno, established himself at a little village not far from the coast, not far from the sea, and began to preach the gospel. Among those who heard him and were convinced by his message was a young lady called Winifred, or if you prefer the Welsh version of her name, Gwenfrewi, and she determined after some time to commit her life to serving the church. There was only one small problem. She had caught the eye of a local prince who rather hoped she would commit her life to him in marriage. And things rather came to a head, you'll see what I did there in a moment, one Sunday morning outside the church when the prince galloped up on his horse, once again begged Winifred to marry him, and when she refused, he drew his sword and struck off her head with a single blow. Well, thankfully, for the young lady, the story doesn't end there. For the prince, I suspect it rather does, having lost his temper in this way. I doubt that he had much luck with the local ladies after that. But for Winifred, the news was good, because as her head rolled to a stop on the turf, Bueno stepped out of the church, saw what had happened, and immediately picked up the severed head, restored it to its place on the body, and the young lady was healed, restored to life, and went on to live a long and happy life, doing what she wanted to do, which was serving the church. But the other part to the story is this, that apparently, on the very spot where her head first struck the ground, a spring of water burst from the turf and continued to flow from then on. Well, you can imagine, I'm sure, in this climate of locations being seen as sacred, that it wasn't long before pilgrims started to come from all over the place to St. Winifred's well. And at some point it was discovered that if you drank the water or bathed in the pool which had been constructed there, you could be healed. And so, for a time at least, Holywell in North Wales, not far from the North Wales Coast Road, became a site of pilgrimage to rival Lourdes in France. The only problem is that literally nothing I've just told you is likely to be true. That's not because I'm lying, it's just because this is a highly improbable story. We start off with the idea of this virgin young woman and a spring of holy water. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but in many of the churchyards around Britain there are yew trees. If you know anything about the way these trees grow, it's not difficult to ascertain that in many cases the yew trees significantly predate the church by 1,000 years or more, sometimes 2,000, 3,000 years predating the church. And in some cases, such as in Hope Bagot, not very far from the Worcestershire-Shropshire border, there's also a spring of holy water, holy in a pagan sense, beneath the yew tree in the churchyard. Now, the reason why these things come together, I suspect, is that these missionaries were no fools. If they saw that there was a place where the local people had for hundreds or thousands of years gathered for some sort of ritual or worship, well, they adopted the place and built their church there. But it seems that this idea of young women being sacrificed or beheaded at springs of water is likely to have rather darker pagan origins. And in the case of Holywell, the same would be true. Furthermore, this idea of building where there is a spring of water is typical of these Celtic missionaries. The picture that's just come up on the screen is of St. Trillo's chapel, a little further along the Welsh coast, further west. And if we duck inside, we see that there is, it's covered over now, but there's a spring and a pool just about large enough for a person to be baptized in, by the way, underneath the altar in this little tiny stone-built chapel. It's very much credible to think that St. Bueno would have established his little chapel in the same kind of way, at a place where there was already a spring of water. But there's another twist in this tale. You see, the hills behind Holywell are very rich in minerals, and all the way back to Roman times they've been used for lead mining and stone quarrying and so on. At some point, whether a mine was too deeply drained or some rather stronger than usual blasting powder was used, something disturbed the strata, and the spring at Holywell dried up. Well, of course, the church didn't want to lose out on the income from pilgrims, and so they paid a local contractor to pipe in water from somewhere else, and it was business as usual on Monday morning, and the healings seem to have continued. And by the way, when I talk about healings, of course I accept that amongst all those claiming to have been healed, there may be some frauds, some people who simply lied about it, for whatever reason. Furthermore, it's probable that amongst all of those healed, there were some who simply enjoyed a cessation of their symptoms arising from a sort of emotional overload of completing their pilgrimage and hoping that some miracle would follow, and undoubtedly within hours or days those symptoms returned. But I don't think we can deny that anybody was ever healed here. If you go there today, you can still see these graffiti carved into the stone of the chapel by thankful people who have been healed. And there's a display of crutches, some very, very old-fashioned, some more modern, because St. Winifred's Well apparently is a site where those with skeletal and joint complaints may be healed particularly. But the interesting thing about this is that, as I've just illustrated to you, the location itself really has no sacred history attached to it. We know that the water, at least in the last 100 or 200 years, is simply tap water to all intents and purposes. The pool itself is not miraculous. It didn't really spring up after a miraculous healing by a saint. So the question is, how are people healed at such a location? The answer, I think, comes from a story we looked at last time, which is this of the woman, a woman who'd had a serious medical condition, a hemorrhage, for some 12 years. And she finally went to Jesus, not wishing to draw attention to herself. She simply crept through the crowd and reached out to touch the hem of his garment, and was instantly healed. But I'd like you to notice the end of this passage here, verse 48. Then he, that is Jesus, said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Now, the significance of this I do not think can be overlooked. Of course, I'm not suggesting that somehow there is something inside of a person which, if suitably, shaped and encouraged and built up, can produce healing. I'm not suggesting that rather New Age kind of idea. Of course, we understand that the healing of this woman and any other healing since take place as a result of the power of God. But it seems that faith opens up a channel or a connection between the human experience and the power of God. And that, I believe, is what was taking place at Holywell. And that's what takes place in the gospel stories, where time after time we hear Jesus saying, "Your faith has healed you. Your faith has played a part in this miracle." Let's talk for a moment about what faith is because sometimes Christian believers tend to make faith synonymous with belief, but I want to suggest there's a slight difference. Because when we look at the stories of faith, for example, those recorded in Hebrews 11, we find that faith always seems to result in action. Take this example of Noah. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, wrote a PhD dissertation on the nature of God and the environment. That's not what it says, is it? It doesn't say that Noah had tremendous belief or he had great theological knowledge. It says he got out his toolkit and he did something. He did something in response to his faith. Here's another example. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. It doesn't say that Abraham believed something specific about God. It doesn't say that Abraham sat in the town square and discoursed at great length about the nature of God. It says that Abraham did something. And this idea of faith leading to action is a vital part of our understanding and something we're going to explore further this morning. So let's go to our story and let's talk about the pool of Bethesda. Somewhere around about 600 BC, the inhabitants of Jerusalem decided they needed a better source of water, and so a stone wall was built across a wadi or valley up in the mountains behind Jerusalem. And a rock-cut channel was constructed, sort of contouring around all the hillsides from that location down to this place outside the city gates of Jerusalem. By the way, at that time, it was outside the gates of Jerusalem. The city was, of course, later extended to incorporate it. One of the most interesting features of this, and you'll see in a moment why this is significant, is that the last part of the water's journey required it to go down across a valley and up the other side. And to accomplish this, they built effectively a stone pipe which formed a siphon. That is, because the water was higher on one side, it would flow down, it would flow up the other side and continue in a channel down into the pool. And it is suggested, by the way, that if the water level was just right or just wrong, depending on how you look at it, that air could be sucked into this siphon, which would then be released under considerable pressure into the pool. And that may give you a clue as to what we're going to read later on. Originally outside the sheep gate, as I said, later it was incorporated. Now there's an interesting detail in the story, which is that the gospel writer describes this pool as having 5 porticos or 5 covered colonnades. For a long time people were very sceptical about this because the idea of a 5-sided pool seemed out of keeping with the architecture of the time. But when archaeologists finally uncovered the pool of Bethesda, they found in fact it was 2 pools. And you don't have to be a genius to work out that gives us a colonnade on one side, another on the top, another on this side, another on this end. That's 4, and one across the middle between the 2 pools, giving us 5 in total. And yet again, the biblical record was proven to be historically accurate. Now, of course, like any old structure, these pools had gone through various iterations of usage. And one of the things it was used for during the Greek times, prior to the time of Christ, was as Asclepion. The story behind this is that Asclepius was a doctor who specialized in having his patients modify their diet, drink plenty of water, and bathe regularly. And we thought that the Victorians invented the water cure, but no, it goes all the way back to Greek times. And so successful was this doctor that when he died, he was kind of elevated, if you will, to the status of a demigod. And these Asclepian pools were constructed all over the place for people to enjoy the health-giving benefits. And the deal here would have been that you'd show up with some kind of small votive offering and mumble a few incantations or something and take a bath in the pools and hopefully see some alleviation of your symptoms. There's some suggestion that by the time of Jesus, one of these pools at least had been converted to a mikveh, that is, a Jewish ritual bath. But it seems, in what we read earlier, that this Greek idea of healing taking place at these pools had perpetuated. I just want to unpack that story a little bit, this idea of this angel coming down to trouble the waters. First of all, this seems rather incompatible with what we read of angel behaviour elsewhere. This rather random sort of behaviour which may or may not actually benefit anyone isn't something we find angels doing elsewhere. Furthermore, it would seem rather unfair if God offered healing in this way. Just think about it, some guy with a little bit of eczema on his elbow would have a pretty good chance of getting into the pool quickly when the waters were troubled. Meanwhile, our poor paralysed man, who really desperately needed healing, would have no chance at all. So it seems rather unfair and unlike the kind of God we talk about. In fact, this idea of healing at these pools seems to be no more than a perpetuation of the Asclepius myth, mingled with the fact that there was this, to them, inexplicable troubling of the waters when air was sucked into the siphon and released into the pool under pressure. But we come back to the same question, because it seems only credible that people were indeed healed at this pool. When the water was troubled and someone jumped into the water, people were healed. Now again, we'll offer the two caveats. Some of those people would have been frauds to enjoy their few minutes of fame. They would have claimed to have been healed there. Some might have been overcome by the elation of the moment and enjoyed a cessation of their symptoms. But I think it's only fair to believe that for this reputation to continue, some people must have been genuinely healed. And again, we point the finger at this idea of faith. A faith which causes action, being there at the pool, being willing to get into the pool, and faith which opens up a connection so that the power of God can work in our lives. So let's look specifically at this story. We're told there that one was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. The slightly older translations of the Bible will say that this man was paralysed. Whether that was precisely the case or whether he was simply invalided in some way, I'm not sure. But the most important words in that sentence are that the man was there. Just picture for a minute what might have happened if Jesus went to the pool of Bethesda and this man had decided to stay home that day. What if he had decided to go and see family? What if he'd organised for some other event to take place, or he'd gone to a football match, or whatever? All of those things in their own right, good and valid, but they would have meant he wasn't there when Jesus came calling. And that message is incredibly important for us as people of faith. We need to be there, and the there I'm referring to is church. We need to be there. Of course, it's possible to encounter Jesus elsewhere, perhaps walking in the country or sitting by the seaside or whatever else. But church has been very, very carefully, the whole process of church has been very, very carefully engineered to create every possible opportunity for an encounter with God. Why would we not be there every week, no matter, no excuse? Use the other 6 days of the week for everything else that needs to be done, but set aside time on that day of the week to be there, where we know we can have an encounter with God. And by the way, in the story of this man, being there was undoubtedly not easy. If he slept out there at night, that would have been a pretty, rough sleeping kind of situation. If he somehow was dragged there each day, either which way, again, we see this man's faith being displayed in his action. Jesus asks the man a question. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" And that seems like such a strange question, doesn't it? I mean, the guy's paralysed. Of course he wants to get well. Or he's an invalid. Of course he wants to get well. He's there at the pool. Of course he's there because he wants to get well. And yet, that the answer isn't always obvious, is it? Some people, sadly, who've been in a particular condition for a very long time, the condition becomes so much a part of their identity that the truth is, They can't even imagine their life without that condition, and they begin to define themselves by the condition. And the truth is, they probably don't want to get well. And in spiritual terms, because of course this is how we should apply this, the answer to this question is normally no. You ask most people, do you want to get well? And their answer will be, well, I don't do anyone any harm. I do my best to help out my neighbour. I'm always nice to those around me. I'm fine as I am. There's no positive response to the, do you want to get well? But it really is a question we need to ask ourselves. Are we self-satisfied with where we are? Do we think we're good enough? Or do we, in spiritual terms, really want to get well? Then comes the most incredible irony of this story. Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Can you spot the irony in this? Here is this man talking to Jesus, the Son of God, the creator of the universe. And even if his theology doesn't quite rise to understanding the person of Jesus, he must have known that Jesus was the young rabbi who went around healing people, restoring sight to the blind, bringing folks back to life, And yet the man presents to Jesus his own method by which he hopes to be healed. I need to do this. I need to do this way. About the only useful comment in this whole sentence is when he says, I can't do it. I'm not quick enough. I'm not strong enough. I can't do it on my own. But in a spiritual sense, how often we propose our own solution to the problem. If we feel from time to time that we're not well spiritually, what do we do about that? Well, we try to do this better, or we try to master our bad temper, or we try to overcome some bad habit, or whatever else it is. We propose our own solution. But the only way to truly receive healing is to do ultimately what this man did and say, look, it's hopeless. I can't do it. I need to hand it over to someone who can. Will we, in the end, like this man did, admit that we need Jesus? Well, then the dramatic part happens. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And at once the man was cured, and he did pick up his mat, and he did walk. And again, I think we see the man's faith in action. It would surely have been the easiest thing in the world to look up at Jesus and say, are you joking? Are you mocking me? I haven't moved for 38 years. How do you think I'm going to move now? How can I pick up my mat and walk? But he didn't say that. He picked up his mat. He called on those muscles that hadn't moved for 38 years, those joints that hadn't flexed, the legs that hadn't supported his weight. And he got up and he picked up his mat and he walked. There's a curious part to this which I sort of I wonder about, and I agree this is simply speculation, but you remember the story of Jairus and his daughter? The young girl had been sick and eventually she died, and Jesus went in and restored her to life. But the astonishing thing is that having given life back to the girl, Jesus then turned to the parents and said, now feed her. Give her something to eat. She'll be hungry. Jesus understood that the girl needed to get her strength back. In other words, there were two parts to the healing. First, the restoration of life, and then secondly, the restoration of strength. And I wonder with this man, if you've ever broken an arm or a leg and had it encased in plaster, you'll know that when the plaster finally comes off, your arm has shrunk to about the thickness of your little finger. The muscles have wasted away. Can you imagine the state of this man's muscles after 38 years an invalid? And I just wonder, did Jesus do both parts of the miracle, restoring his ability to move and restoring him to full strength? Or was he simply given back the ability to move? And did he, for the following weeks, maybe months, go to bed each night with every muscle aching as he exercised them and worked them and strengthened them day by day, each day getting stronger and better? And the reason I ask this question is because when we talk about spiritual healing, sometimes the rebirth, the born-again experience is complete. Both parts happen. We are healed of our sinful past, and we no longer struggle with the bad habits or the inclinations we once had. But sometimes, though we are healed of our sinful past, it takes a lifetime of exercise, of strain, of aching spiritual muscles for us to really become fully mobile in a spiritual sense again. We too can receive healing, but I do wonder whether for everyone the whole process is instant, or whether or not, as I've described, it can take a lifetime. In the process we call in that instance sanctification. So let's try to apply this. First of all, if we are to come to Jesus, we need to decide that we truly want to be well. Then we need to accept that our own solution, just trying hard and just reading self-help books, won't really solve the problem. When we hand the thing over to God and we do what he says, then we can receive healing in a spiritual sense. But I'd like to explore further this idea that we started off with the pools where healing took place. And I'd like to look at it by taking the example of baptism. We have here this passage in Matthew describing the baptism of Jesus. It says, Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. And John objected to it, of course. He understood who Jesus really was. He recognized him. But Jesus replied, "Let it be so now. It's proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." And John consented, and so we have this event taking place. Now, baptism is first comes to our notice with the story of Jesus being baptized. And it seems that what John had done was take something with which Jews were very familiar, the idea of ritual washing. This is something from the Old Testament where essentially God had told his people that they were not to go up to the temple to worship if they were unclean. And in simple terms, what God actually commanded was that people had to go and take a bath before going to the temple. And specifically, if they'd done something which might have left them contaminated, like touching a dead body, for example, then they had to go and bathe before going amongst people up at the temple. And we can see a very simple logic to this, a good way to control the spread of disease and contagion and so on. But by the time of Jesus, by the time of John, the Jews had taken this idea of having a bath and they had turned it into the most incredibly complex ritual. The mikveh had to be a particular size and it had to contain a certain amount of water, and I believe there was even some stipulation about the number of steps that went down into the pool. And I think the Essenes had perfected the thing to such an extent that there was even a division up the middle of the steps, and you had to come down one side and go up the other so that you wouldn't risk being contaminated when you left the water purified and all this kind of thing. Well, John took all of that and he repurposed it. And he repurposed it in a river. And about the only part of this ritual that he carried over was that he baptized at a place called Aenon near Salem because there was plenty of water. In other words, John maintained the one part of the mikveh ritual which was important to him, and that was that it was a full immersion of the person in water. No sprinkling, no tipping a cup of water over their head. They had to actually go down into the water and be immersed, and that required plenty of water. But of course, for John to be doing this in this location, it's not exactly a very attractive body of water, is it? And in fact, if you know your Old Testament stories, you might remember the story of Naaman, who had leprosy, and he went to the prophet in Israel and said, "Hey, can I be cured?" And the prophet said, "Sure, all you have to do is go and bathe in the River Jordan." And poor old Naaman took one look at this rather muddy, unattractive body of water and said, "Thank you, I'd rather stay sick." Now, in the end, luckily, his servants convinced him and he did wash in the Jordan and he was cured. But you can see straight away, can't you, that there's nothing particularly special about the location where John was baptizing, nothing particularly special or sacred about the water. And so what was the point of baptism? What was actually going on there? Well, there are certain elements to baptism which make it very, very significant. The first is we are, of course, following Jesus' example. In a way, we're also symbolizing the death and resurrection of Jesus. For example, in Colossians it says, "Having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. So this idea of going down into the water and coming back up again, which was typical of the mikveh, typical of John's baptism, and typical of Christian baptism today, does symbolise the death, burial and resurrection of Jesus. But churches these days, and for hundreds of years, have baptised in all sorts of locations. Never mind the muddy Jordan River. Some churches baptise in purpose-made facilities. Others use a local swimming baths, or they go down to a river or to the sea. You see, there's nothing special about the location or the water. I think the strongest and most important part of the ritual is the faith of the person undergoing baptism. And in the same way that we saw people being healed at Holywell or at Bethesda as a result of their faith, in the same way, certain Christian rituals are powerful because of the faith of the person going through that ritual. And that faith, in the case of baptism, certainly is spelled out in action, very public action, because baptism is a public ritual which is witnessed by the church typically, and is an expression in action of the person's faith. So let's just summarize this, because we remember this verse that says, without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and rewards those who earnestly seek him. Let's remind ourselves that healing, whether it's physical or spiritual, isn't really about some special sacred location. It isn't about a beautifully constructed pool or church or chapel. It isn't about the elements taken there. For example, the water. Instead, it's about faith. And in the case of baptism, this is one of the reasons why I believe it's vitally important we never pressurize a person to consider baptism. Because it's not about the ritual, it's about the faith of the person. In the same way that the faith of people going to North Wales to Holywell sometimes brought about the healing, because it allowed them to connect with the power of God, and if it was God's will to offer healing, then once that connection was opened, healing followed. And the same is true in Bethesda. The same is true of many of the rituals of the Christian church today. They are dependent upon the faith of the believer. And that faith needs to result in action and obedience to the Word of God.